Welcome back to Do Less Podcast with John and Jeff, where this is absolutely 100% not the third attempt at trying to record this podcast, because that would be doing way too much, and we would never do that. What do you think, John?
You're exactly right, Jeff. This is first go at it, so let's we'll keep it going, keep it light.
Yeah, keep it easy and breezy. What are we talking about today, John?
Talking about the U.S. national debt, our sovereign debt, what it is and where it comes from and why it's a problem.
Yeah. So for those of you who've never heard of the debt or never thought about the debt or have heard about it and still don't care because it's boring, I'm right there with you. It is definitely boring, but I still think it's something we should care about. And so some key distinctions to make here is we're talking about national debt. There's still state and local debt. That is another aspect of debt, but we're just going to be talking about the U.S. national debt.
Federal debt.
Yeah, federal. So just the federal government spending, not state and local. And so right now, as it stands, our federal debt is around $23 trillion. And where that comes from is essentially when you pay your taxes. Hopefully you pay your taxes. You don't want to end up like Wesley Snipes. What happens is the Treasury Department collects that, and they use that to spend on all the other things we vote for, like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the military, all these other things, departments, and whatever else you can think of.
Well, we vote for politicians who do the spending, so we don't actually vote for the programs.
Right.
But yeah, the politicians the reason I make that distinction is because it's like probably would be nice to be able to vote for actual policies and implementations of programs, but we do not do that. We vote for politicians who then spend all the money.
But like currently,
at their whim.
Our technology, I feel, is the barrier stopping us from being able to do that, right? Like if we had to actually go to whatever location and show your ID and vote on every little bill that crosses the floor, like no one would vote ever. It would be way too much of a hassle. I think theoretically you could build a system in which, if it was secure and each person had like a login, then maybe you could just go home and vote on things. But and then I don't know. We don't really need to get into this, but the country was designed to be a republic. It wasn't meant to just vote on everything. You were supposed to pick people to make stuff for you, but that's not really important. Essentially, they're just spending money and they collect taxes to pay for it. But here's the thing. The government doesn't know ahead of time how much money they're going to collect in taxes, right? Because businesses don't know how much money they're going to make in a given year. And so depending on how much they profit, depending if they need to lay people off, et cetera, they have an idea of how much they're going to collect in taxes, but they don't necessarily know the exact amount. And so they're going to set a budget of what they're going to spend, but they may not collect enough to cover that. And if they don't, they already spent that money. So that money has to be collected somehow. And the way they do that is they issue bonds, which is essentially a loan to the government. So if you buy a bond, or a U.S. Treasury bond, you're lending to the U.S. government. And that allows them to spend more than they collect in taxes. And so that's where our debt comes from. So that $23 trillion, that means we've issued $23 trillion worth of bonds out there. And those bonds pay interest. So we have to pay for that too. So that's part of our spending. That's one of the things we spend on is interest as well.
So that 23 trillion is the total sum of all the bonds issued by the federal government. But that doesn't include interest. So the 23 trillion will have to be repaid by the federal government at some point, supposedly with taxes that they are able to garner from the population, plus interest. So 23 trillion is just the base.
And so when we just throw out numbers like 23 trillion, what does that mean to anyone? It's kind of hard to conceptualize 23 trillion. So maybe we can put that a little bit into context for you. So the current GDP in the US is around 20 trillion, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, 19, I think.
19. Okay. So
1920.
Yeah, so what GDP is basically if you just add up all the income earned, so like everyone's salary plus everyone's profits from businesses or assets that they own, whatever it may be. So you just add up all the income of everyone in the country. That's the GDP. And so if the GDP is like 19, 20 trillion and our debt is 23 trillion, that would be like, let's say you made $100,000 in a year, then that would be like if you had $120,000 in debt hanging over you.
Yeah. And another thing I like to mention when you draw that parallel is if the entire populace of the U.S. were to commit themselves to say in 1 year we're going to work just as hard and just as long as we were going to in a normal year, but for some reason this year we're not going to keep a single dollar of our paychecks. We're going to give it all to the government. We're going to be taxed at 100%. So that would mean the government, and if everyone actually did, like in this thought experiment, say everyone is as productive as they would have been, everyone's able to earn as much as they otherwise would have in a free market. If they were to pledge their entire salary if every person was to pledge their entire salary to the government, that would be 80% of the debt outstanding, right? So that experiment happens, and then they would have to go another, they'd have to go another 2 months to actually cover the debt. So that's
Right.
so think about every single person in the U.S., all of the labor, all of the skills, all of the salaries that every single person makes. That is an astounding number, just to
Right.
kind of speak to the gravity around that number.
And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, my comparison wasn't actually a good comparison because I compared GDP to income, but in this case, we're looking at the income of the Treasury, which is actually tax receipts, right? So their income that they receive from our GDP is around 3.4 trillion. That was what it was in 2018. And like I said, that number can change based on how much people earn, what tax bracket that pushes them into, if that changes, whatever. And so 3.4 trillion is the income and the debt is 23. So that's, let's do some quick math here. 23 divided by 3.4. It's like almost 7 times the income. So that would be like if you made $100,000 in a year, that would be like having $700,000 in debt in your name. That's a more accurate comparison of what we're looking at here. Mm-hmm. And so like John said, if everyone was just really noble and just said, I'm going to spend absolutely nothing on myself. So even that is just impossible, right? Like everyone would die because they would starve. Like everyone's got to eat. So like that's not even possible. But even if just they were somehow able to get all of the income to go to the Treasury, it's still not enough to pay it off. And that's
right.
But that's in 1 year. It's not like we have to pay it off in 1 year.
Right.
So like
some of the maturity on the debt is 30 years, right?
Right.
So the government only has to pay it off 30 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention the interest on that, though. Every year that accrues in interest payments are due until the last year that the actual sum is due for any specific bond at which
Right.
point. So my point is, it's not like it is due next year, and it's not like we need to pay it off next year, but That's just kind of like to speak to the actual, you know, just to kind of put a picture on what that number is.
Right.
The whole workforce of the U.S. banding together is not going to cover it until 14 months of hard work.
Right. And so, as we're trying to put that number into perspective, hopefully this starts to illustrate why this debt could be a problem for us. And if that's not necessarily becoming clear yet, hopefully we can make that a little bit more clear here in a second. And so if you look at the U.S. Financial report from 2018, which I don't expect you to because no one looks at this, like on page 2, the title of that page is An Unsustainable Fiscal Path. So even the Treasury is out here saying this is not sustainable, meaning we cannot keep doing what we're currently doing and stay solvent. We will go bankrupt. That's just
right.
And so to explain why we'll go bankrupt, I'll kind of lay that out, right? So we talked about how the debt, in order to get people to lend you money, you have to pay them interest. No one's going to buy a bond just out of the goodness of their heart. No one loves the government that much. At least I don't think anyone does. So you have to pay them a little bit of interest to get them to lend you money. And generally these bonds are considered safe investments, right? Because the government is really good at collecting taxes because they have a powerful military. And if you don't pay, they'll put you in a cage. So it's pretty good at getting what it wants. So it's considered a safe investment. And so the interest rates are pretty low. They're around 1% to 2% for like the short-term bonds, which is what most of it is. And so, but even still, that interest right now represents about 8% of our current budget. So 8% of our spending right now is just on interest, right? And so if our debt keeps growing and interest rates rise because our solvency starts to become a bit of an issue, increasing the risk makes interest rates go up, then you can start to see that interest start to become 20% of your budget, 30%, 40%. What happens when interest payments start to exceed the amount of tax revenue you can even get, right? So if you have to pay out more in interest than you can even collect in taxes, now you're in a spiraling cycle, because now you have to issue more debt just to cover the debt you couldn't even service. And this is when hyperinflation happens, right? Because there's no way out. You either default or you just start printing money to fix the problem. And so that's where you go bankrupt, right? When you just cannot even get enough tax money to pay off the interest you owe, because then you're not even covering any of the debt. You just can't even cover the interest. And so that's the path we're on right now. And that's why they're saying it's unsustainable.
Yeah, right. And so so you mentioned the commentary that the Treasury has on its own debt, it's calling it unsustainable. Similarly, we've talked about the Federal Reserve, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve in his testimony to Congress this week had a whole spiel about fiscal spending, which is the Congress spending, which is the Treasury spending, needs to be reined in, needs to become more responsible. It's unsustainable. He similarly said that's unsustainable. That could be a potential cause for problems in the future. So he's adding additional commentary. So basically everyone agrees that it's we can't do this forever, but nobody's actually going to step up to actually stop it, because that would be hard.
Right.
It's not very easy to reduce spending. Right.
And so the multiple end game scenarios here are, like I said, if it keeps going on the path it's going on, eventually we'll go bankrupt. This is not really up for debate. It's just, if we continue our current trajectory, that's what's going to happen. And so
if you have debt on a credit card and then you're running delinquent on that credit card, so you transfer all that debt to another credit card, and you're able to survive for another couple months because they give you a 0% introductory rate. But then after that rate expires, you're delinquent on those payments. Then you got to transfer that debt to a new credit card. Well, you're fine as long as you can keep transferring to credit cards.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, what happens when someone says, or when no credit card issuers say you can transfer your debt to a new card? At that point, you're sunk. Like you just have to go. You have to declare bankruptcy. Like you say, I can't pay this.
Right.
I have no way of.
Yeah, as soon as you can't make your credit card payments anymore, you can't even make your minimum payments anymore. That's when you're bankrupt. So that's kind of the equivalent of where our national government is headed. And the same is true for a lot of the state and local governments as well. But we're not going to really talk about that. We're just going to talk about the national one. So yeah, this path towards bankruptcy is the path we're currently on. And so the reason this is a problem, the reason bankruptcy is, you might just say, oh, so what? We go bankrupt. Who cares, right? That's kind of a very flippant attitude to have, because here's why you should care, right? So if the government defaults on its debt, okay, who holds that debt? You could say some degree China holds a decent amount, right? But they don't hold that much. The majority is actually in the retirement accounts, like 401ks, pension funds, these other things for U.S. citizens. It's mostly held here among U.S. citizens. So if the government were to default on its debt, basically everyone's plan for retirement gets wiped out. And so a lot of these people are too old to even go back to work, or just they haven't been in the workforce in a while. And the idea of the labor market just being able to take in all these people who were set for retirement, it's not going to be able to handle that. And if these people can't get income, how are they going to feed themselves? Hopefully their family can help them out, but Social Security can't help them out because the government's bankrupt.
And Social Security has money in bonds.
Right, yeah. Social Security also has its income derived from bonds. So there's no source of income for these people. There's no one to help them out anymore. And so that's a big problem. That's a really big problem. They could starve. That's a really big problem. So defaulting...
Yeah, and to also kind of point this to something you may hear in your life, the allocation of your 401k recommendation, you've probably heard people kind of explain to you what your 401k should kind of be invested in. When you're young, they say it's okay to be risky, so have it mostly in stocks. But then as you get older, as you near your retirement age, they say to transition from stocks to bonds. Like Jeff said, bonds are considered a safe asset. And so that's that's the government debt, bonds. Like lending your money to the government is said to be the safest investment, because the government always has paid it back. So like the standard, your standard worker in the course of their life is going, as they're getting older, as they're nearing retirement, and as they enter retirement, is allocating more and more to bonds, and to the point when they're eventually retired, and like Jeff said, has no more income source. The bonds are their income source. They are depending on the government to pay them back the money that they lent.
Right.
Social Security holds its money in bonds too. So if the government just said we can't pay bonds back, then Social Security would be bankrupt
and
well.
Medicare as well.
And Medicare. That's there. So all of these pools of money that are caring for people that are probably, the more elderly members of our society that can't support themselves, or maybe the sick that can't support themselves. Those are the people that would be hurt the most by a U.S. bankruptcy, by a U.S. default on bonds.
Right. Another thing to think about is actually to become a money manager, or there's a lot of regulation. And one of those regulations is you have to recommend people to buy more bonds as they get older. It's like 60% requirement for some, there's just a lot of regulation around. So almost everyone's savings accounts, or just savings, is being pooled into government debt. So if the government just defaulted, then this would be a really big disaster. So that's not really a good solution, right? Okay, so what are the other solutions, or what are the other potential problematic outcomes, right? So let's say the government doesn't default, but it cannot collect enough tax revenue to pay for it. What can it do? Well, it issues the currency that those bonds are denominated in. So it could just print money to pay for it. Okay? But if you're printing money to cover the interest that you couldn't collect from tax money, then you're just going to have a perpetual cycle of printing more and more money to cover the debt you can't cover. And this is what has happened in places like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Germany back in the day. These countries have all had problems with hyperinflation. And the reason for that is because they printed a bunch of money to pay for the debts they couldn't pay back because they didn't want to default for all the reasons we just explained.
I want to point to a symptom of this problem that we're speaking about. If you look at any bond interest rate over the last 40 years, I'll just stick with a 10-year for an example. If you look at the 10-year treasury, so 10-year debt that the government issues, over the last 40 years, it has gone straight down, almost in like a line. It used to be like, I think it used to be upwards of like 10 or maybe 15%, and today it's under 2%, right? And that, the reason I say that's a symptom is because the government cannot afford for that interest rate to go beyond 2%. It's already, the interest payments per year are already 8% of expenditure, right? 8% of every dollar you give to the government. Actually, it's more than that, because they spend
they
on
overspend,
deficits.
right? Yeah,
right. So, but if that 10-year treasury rate were to go above 2%, that would just mean more interest for the government to spend per year, right? So the government has a high interest. It's the stakes are high for the government to not let that rate go above 2%, no matter what the market would demand for a bond. The government doesn't want it to go above 2%. So what the Federal Reserve actually does is comes in and saves the day for the federal government. They live to fight another day. The government really needs bonds to not go above 2%. So what happens and the reason that would make them go above 2%, we don't have to get too much into it, but the bonds are bought and sold on a secondary market, depending on the price, which is inversely related to the yield. So if no one wants the bonds, then that means that the price is actually going to go down and the yield is going to go up. We don't have to get into what that exactly means, but if no one wants a bond that yields, like Jeff said before, 0%, so it would go up, and then someone might say, I'll take it at 1%. If no one wants it at 1%, then it would go to 2%. If no one wants it at 2%, it would go to at 3%. Someone might finally say, okay, actually, I will take it at 3%. You know, once the yield is high enough, people will might actually elect to buy it.
Right.
So when there's less demand, the yield goes up.
Yeah. So like a simple example would be like, let's say you have two friends, and one of them is a really hard worker and they just save all their money all the time, and the other one goes gambling in Atlantic City every weekend. Who are you more likely to give a loan to? You know, who's more trustworthy? And it'd probably be not the guy gambling unless he's really good at it, I guess. But you'd probably be much more likely to give the guy who saves a bunch of money and is very responsible. You're much more likely to give him a loan. In fact, you may even just help him out in the kindness of your heart and not even charge him at all. But if the guy who gambles all the time asks for a loan, you're going to be like, all right, you got to pay me back double, you know?
Right.
And that's the same with governments, right? So Italy is infamous for being very irresponsible, and so they're gonna have to pay a higher rate to get people to lend to them than, for example, the US, which has a pretty solid history.
Right. So even though the US does have a solid history, it is still subject to the market of supply and demand for the bonds. So if people don't want the bonds, that would make the yield go up. So if what we're saying today, strikes fear into people's bank accounts, and they say, I don't want yeah, all of a sudden people really don't want to lend the government money. They say we need a much higher interest rate than 2% to lend the government money. Well, there's another entity that steps in, and that's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will then buy treasuries to keep the price below, to keep the yield below 2%, for example. That helps the federal government manage the debt. But how do they do it? They print money.
Right.
It's not like you've gotten around it somehow. The federal government is just kicking the can down the road. They're
Right.
saying we're going to cover this stress that you have today. We'll keep the interest rates lower by printing money and buying bonds when they get too high and keeping the interest rate low.
Right. And so if they keep doing this, if we keep printing money, so even though it's not the US government that prints money, it's the Federal Reserve, it doesn't matter, right? It's tomato. Like at the end of the day, the way we're paying for it is printing money. And what does that do? It causes inflation. So when people try to get like cute with all this stuff, it's not more complicated than it really sounds. There's a couple ways you can pay for things, right? You can collect taxes from people, you can issue debt, and debt you still need taxes to collect. So really at the end of the day, the only ways to pay for things are taxes and printing money. And so it's one or the other. And so if we're not collecting enough taxes, we're printing money. That's it.
And so what I described is there's actually a kind of a subtlety that is even more absurd than what this all lets on to. So if the Federal Reserve prints money to buy treasuries, right? Well, now they have treasuries on their balance sheet. That means the federal government, the U.S. Treasury, owes the Federal Reserve that money back plus interest. Well, the thing about the Federal Reserve is it's not a for-profit entity. It is a private entity, but it's not for-profit. All of its profits, it's actually supposed to give to the U.S. Treasury. So you could say, oh, the Federal Reserve with all those bonds must be doing pretty well. Well, no, the U.S. Treasury takes the profits from the Federal Reserve. So the U.S. government is paying the Federal Reserve to lend it money by printing money, which the U.S. Treasury then takes the profit of back from the Federal Reserve.
Right.
So essentially the net effect is just money was printed.
Right. And so, and the reason, again, that this is a problem, printing money is not a free way out any more than defaulting is a free way out, because inflation makes it very difficult for economies to function. Because imagine if your employer is saying, okay, I'm going to pay you $100,000 a year. Well, what if you have literally no idea what you can get with that? How do you know to agree to those terms or not? If you have no clue, this is why no one gets paid in something like Bitcoin, for example, because it swings wildly. No one would accept a salary in Bitcoin because you have no clue what that Bitcoin is going to be worth today or tomorrow. So you need a currency that's stable in prices or in the broad market. Otherwise, it's so hard for people to negotiate with one another. It's hard to buy and sell things because you don't know what your money is going to be worth now. And so what happens is no one can save money because they just have no clue what that money is going to be worth. So it just really incentivizes everyone to just live in the now and just spend now. And if that seems like a good idea, how are we ever going to grow if we never save? You know, think about like if you wanted to start a business and no one wanted to lend to you, how are you ever going to start that business if you just spend all your money that you earned today? You're never going to be able to. So you can never get out of the hole you're in unless you save, right? And so if we have inflation, then no one's saving and our economy can't grow. We're just stuck in the now.
People are really disincentivized from saving when interest rates are low because they're not going to be rewarded for money that they set aside. If you don't spend it today, you're essentially subjecting yourself to unnecessary risk.
Mm-hmm.
When interest rates are so low, that makes alternatives by comparison better, and so irrational spending becomes more normal.
Right. And so, I mean, hopefully by now you recognize that this is a serious problem, because, like we said, we're on no path to pay this thing off anytime soon. It's gonna get out of control, and like we said, a bankruptcy or inflation can represent a collapse in the economy as we know it. There's still gonna be economic activity. There's always gonna be, but it's gonna be unrecognizable to what it's like today. And it's going to be a lot more painful. It's a real collapse in the standard of living. So unless people out there, are just keen on taking a huge hit to their standard of living, this should be important to you. And so I think now that we've talked about why this is a problem, we should probably get into potential solutions to the problem.
We drew a very drastic picture towards the beginning of this podcast about, if everyone banded together and provided 100% of their income to pay off this debt, it would take 14 months. That's not necessary. So that's not even if that was a potential solution, we don't even need to do that. Literally, this solution is a modicum of financial responsibility by way of Congress. All you would have to. So if you look at the national debt over the past, especially the last 20 years, it is in free fall. It's in the national debt is almost exponentially increasing, right? And we've already illustrated why that's a problem, right? So to stop that, you just have to dial it back, right? We don't even need to spend at, we don't have to stop deficit spending. We can continue to deficit spend, but just at a reduced rate,
Right.
to wean ourselves off. That would show signs of sustainability. That would show signs that we can rein ourselves back in. When we all we do show is a free fall, that begs the question: can we even stop it?
Mm-hmm.
Is this machine just chugging along? Does anyone have the actual, responsibility in Congress or in the president's office to be able to say stop? Something needs to change and actually enact a feasible change.
Right.
Actually show that it can be dialed back.
And so before we talk, so cutting spending is one potential solution, but there's other theoretical solutions, right? So we talked about increasing tax revenue, right? So theoretically, if we collected more tax revenue, that could pay off the debt, right? And so if you're of the belief that all this spending is 100% necessary, we can't get rid of any of it, absolutely not. We can't even cut a little bit, not even one bit. Then we have to increase our tax revenue. We have to, right? But here's the thing. So let's say you tax someone 20% of their income. That's about standard of what is today. They might work just as hard as they normally would and give you that 20% and say that's the cost of living in America. So be it. Okay? But what if we keep spending the way we're spending, and now the only way to pay off that debt is to have the tax rate be at 50 or even higher of the average person? Imagine the government's taking half of every dollar you earn. At some point, you're going to start to feel discouraged to earn more than you already are, right? So, that number is probably different for everyone, but we can all say if the tax rate was 100%, no one would show up to work. I can guarantee you that. If the tax rate was 100%, right, there's not a single person showing to work. And it's probably true for 90% and 80%, But somewhere along that way, people are just going to say, you know what? It's not worth it. I give up. I'm not going to work. You're just taking everything I earn. At some point, people are just going to throw in the towel. So we can acknowledge there's a line somewhere. I don't necessarily know where that is, and there's not a lot of data to support it, but some estimates tend to believe that if you tax beyond 15 to 20%, then you're actually going to start reducing the amount people want to work. And so you're going to be taxing a smaller pool of income, right? So if your tax burden goes beyond 20%, let's say, then the GDP is going to start to fall. People are going to work less because they're going to be discouraged. And so that 15 to 20%, even if you get it to 30 or 50, it's going to be on a smaller number, right? So 15 to 20% of 20 trillion is more money than 80% of 1 trillion, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, so what you're describing is the Laffer curve,
right.
which, yeah, so the extremes at 0% tax and at 100% tax, in both of those scenarios, you get $0 of tax revenue,
Right.
right? And there's somewhere in between there that it's actually maximized. Call it 20, call it 15, where people are encouraged to work, they don't mind paying the tax. When it goes above that, it becomes prohibitive, and you actually start to see the decline in tax revenue. Even though you're raising the tax, you're raising the tax amount, you're actually decreasing tax revenue.
Right. So you're increasing the rate, the percentage, but you're decreasing the money, the actual amount of money the government is receiving to pay off its loans. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? If we're talking about the debt, what matters is revenue, not rate. Okay? So you can sit around talking about rate all day, but there is a theoretical maximum amount that you can get for a given amount of productivity, right? So we have a given amount of productivity. People go to work, they do the best they can to better their lives for themselves and their family. And that's what's given. And so given that amount, there's a maximum amount of tax revenue we can actually get from that. And so if our spending is higher than that maximum amount, raising taxes is not a solution because we can't actually get any more tax revenue out. It won't work. So that's not a solution.
Right. And this is something I actually wanted to say before, but that's a good place to mention, to kind of step back and just kind of comment on the philosophy of government spending. Government spending is supposed to increase, economic output, right? For the government to say, I'm going to spend $1 and I'm going to recoup it in taxes, well, that theoretically, that $1 that was spent should create more than $1 of economic activity.
In revenue.
Then it's no problem. Yeah, in revenue. So if economic activity goes up fourfold, then from that $1, or it goes up $4 from that $1, then you can tax 25%, no problem. You've just covered your cost, and it's actually net zero. Opportunistically, it would be less than net zero. The government would be providing value and actually spurring economic activity at no cost.
And essentially, that's no different than a profit. That's basically what a profit is. It's just the government would be the one profiting, right? If they spent money, that's no different than a business spending money, right? And then if that increases their revenue in return, just like if a business spends more and that increases their revenue in turn, that's a profit, right? And so theoretically, the government can profit if what they're doing is profitable, right? But we're not profiting. We're going deeper and deeper into debt. So clearly what they're doing, if they're arguing to you that this is going to stimulate GDP and it'll pay for itself, it doesn't. It hasn't.
Right.
And I don't think it will, because it hasn't.
Yeah, necessarily the government's stance has to be, by overspending 23 trillion more than what we were able to collect, we believe that people's salaries will increase by 23 trillion or more. I mean, definitely more, because it's got to cover interest as well, like we mentioned. So 23 trillion plus interest over the next X amount of years, that will be easily collectible from this economy that we're stimulating so much. That's not an issue then. If we can easily say, yeah, there's no problem, 23 trillion over the next 23 trillion plus over the next 30 years, that's no problem. But people aren't, that's not what the argument is. It's not what you hear, right? It's not like the economic theory, that economic philosophy is not what's being discussed. It's, we must do this because this is the right thing to do. This is what we want to do. This is what will make us feel good. Well, you gotta do less. You gotta do what you can prove. If you can prove that it's gonna garner more income, then feel free. you know.
Right.
But proving that is very, very hard.
Mhm.
That is a very hard thing to do.
Right. And so, yeah, right now, we're spending. It's not paying for itself. If it was, we wouldn't be going deeper and deeper into debt. So that argument would be false. If you hear people saying it'll pay for itself, you know,
When?
yeah, when?
When is it
Because
gonna-
it never has. So when?
Yeah.
You know, I be careful when people say stuff like that. And so the reality is, when the government spends, it's generally not profitable. And the reason for that is they don't have competition. They don't have anyone else who's going to get their revenue instead, except other countries. But people don't really move just off the top of the hat like that. Oh, you're spending too much, I'm out. Like, people don't really do that. It's a little like
They haven't
it's-
yet.
yeah,
They might
yeah.
in the
Eventually they
future.
do, right? Like, everyone left Venezuela eventually, right? And so, I mean, there's still people who got stuck there because unfortunately they didn't have enough resources to get out. But, you know,
That's a humanitarian crisis.
Right,
That's, like,
exactly.
not.
that's
That's
not what
not
we
a.
want.
Right.
Yeah. And so, yes, technically they have competition in the form of other countries, but immigration is not like, it's not a very highly competitive market, I guess you could say. Because it's not like people can just move just like that.
It's very high friction. There's a lot
Yeah.
of friction in that market.
Exactly. And so essentially the government has a monopoly and really doesn't have much of an incentive to be profitable in that sense. Because, you know, what are people going to do? Move? Eventually, but not right now. And so, generally when they spend, it's not profitable. And so to pay for that spending, you got to tax us. And so we're already probably around that maximum tax revenue that we can get out of our economy. So there's a lot of proposals to collect more tax revenue. Like a highly hot topic these days is a wealth tax as a way to get more revenue. But wealth is money that's out there, right? Income is generated every year. Wealth is like stagnant, right? It's a stationary amount, right? So let's say we took all the wealth of the wealthiest people in America. That would generate about $1 trillion, optimistically speaking, if we could get all of their wealth, which is enough money to run the government for about
3 months.
three months. Okay, so wealth tax is not a solution. It's not. It doesn't solve the issue. We can only do that once. If we took all the money
Yeah.
they had, then we would have to wait the amount of time it took for them to generate that wealth again to get that wealth back, and then take it again, and then we could run the government for another 3 months. Okay, and if we're just taking everyone's wealth, why are they going to
Yeah.
generate it in the first place? They're going to spend it. No one's going to collect wealth in a society that doesn't let you have wealth. So it's a one-time thing, and it gets you 3 months of government spending.
Yeah, right.
This is not a solution. People who
Right.
talk about this solution are lying to you. Okay, so really we're at our maximum of tax receipts we can get, roughly. You know, maybe we can squeeze a little bit here or there if we're clever about how we do. But the point is, for the most part, we're at that maximum of tax revenue we can get. Around it, we're near it, right? It's not
Right.
going to go big. We're not going to have big gains in either direction by moving this needle. Is my point. So really,
Right.
the only solution we have left is cutting spending. That's the only real
Punishment.
solution.
Exactly. Yeah, you really flushed out that. So like, yeah, two options: increase taxes or decrease spending. Increasing taxes is not.
It's not an option.
It's not an option. So that's decreasing spending. And I think you touched on something that I think is really, really the key. It all boils down to this: it's the incentive. It's the incentive of the federal government. You hear all the time stories about congressmen and elected officials who are incentivized to spend more so that next year they have a budget at or greater than what they had this year, right?
Right.
If they don't spend enough, they are punished. There's punishment in not spending, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at that alone is the incentive that is driving this train off its tracks.
Mhm.
That is unsustainable. That is a problem. That is the problem, right? If you had the incentive the opposite way to spend the least amount to spend as least as you can, to spend the least amount that you can.
Yeah, do less.
Yeah. If the incentive was to spend less, to do less, then you could see what I was saying. You could see some degree of dialing it back, some reining in of spending. But it's the opposite. The opposite is true. The opposite of the solution is the current state. The incentive is to spend more.
Mm-hmm.
Government officials, your job is to enact policy, enact change, and your restriction on that is how much can you spend. Like that is your budget is how much impact you have and how well you can do your job.
Right.
In the opinion of the politicians. So why would they ever agree to less of a budget? They wouldn't. All right, they're incentivized to spend more and to increase their budgets, which is exactly the case of the scenario where this goes.
Well, I would say
south.
is if they have pressure from people who pay taxes and say, I don't want to pay more taxes to cover this spending, then suddenly they have like a re-election incentive to cut spending, right? Because if people want less taxes, suddenly there's a new incentive for them to cut spending. But I think that's one of the issues here, right? And so this is a common misnomer that people have, is that the rich people in this country aren't paying taxes, or they're not paying their fair share, or what have you. This is a misconception, okay? If you look at if you look at the 1% of people, they earn 20% of the income, which is a lot, right? But they pay 40% of the taxes, okay? So 40% of our tax revenue is coming from the 1% of people who earn 20% of the income. So they're paying double in terms of a ratio of how much of the proportion of the income they have, right? So if it was like equivalent, if they had 20% of the income, they'd pay 20% of the taxes, but they don't. They pay 40%. So they pay double in proportion, okay? And so then 50% of Americans essentially pay no taxes at all if you look at the benefits they receive from the government and you like net them out. And so actually most people don't feel the burden of taxes whatsoever. And so that incentive to cut spending is only coming from the 50% of the people to begin with who are actually paying taxes, right? And so you have basically this split base of people, one who's like has no reason to request lower spending, and another half. So basically you have to have the half of people who would care somehow convince the other half who really has no reason to care to vote along with them. And that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, 50% is a pretty significant number when it comes to popular vote.
Right.
So, all you need is 51% of people who don't care. So 1% that's uneducated to allow unfavorable spending. And I think it's a lot more than 1% of people that pay taxes don't really care.
Right.
And so you see these wild spending proposals on both sides of the aisle. Both Republicans and Democrats are spending, and no one is reeling them in. We're cheering them on. We're cheering them on when the spending is aligned with who we agree with.
Right.
But we don't stop and think. No spending is also an option. Less spending. Doing less is also an option.
Doing less is in fact an option. Yeah, and it seems like people they're much more concerned with who is spending than how much and if it's viable. And so, we say we got to cut spending. And the question is, okay, what are we going to cut spending on? Okay, so let's look at the budget. So earlier we told you that 8% is spent on interest. Okay, so that we can't cut that, because if we cut that, then no one's going to lend to us. Okay, we got to pay our interest. It's not an option. All right. Then we have 23% on Social Security. Okay. Now, this is obligations we've already made. Okay, so we can't cut that now because that would be the same as defaulting. But what we can do is stop making future promises. So we can start to lower that portion that's Social Security. So currently this is considered non-discretionary spending, right? Because it's obligations we've already made, so we can't just not pay it. That would be defaulting on your obligations.
Defaulting, yeah.
But that 20%, 3%, we can make that proportion go down if we reform Social Security. This is something no one wants to touch. No political party wants to reform Social Security. It's like political suicide. No one wants to touch it. But that's 23% of the pie. That's a big piece of the pie. Okay, another big piece of the pie is Department of Health and Human Services. So this is like Medicaid and Medicare. So that's another 25%. So between Social Security and healthcare, that's about half of the pie. Okay, so if we reform those, we can save a lot. All right, and then another one is 21% is all other. So that's like discretionary spending, and then we have 8% for the VA. Me personally, I don't think you cut the VA because it's like someone goes out and fights a war that I don't think we should have been fighting anyway, gets their legs blown off, and now they can't work a job they should have been able to. Like, we got to help that guy, in my opinion. You can argue about it, but my opinion is you don't cut from that. And so, this is what we should be debating, honestly, is what do we cut?
Right.
That's a hard thing to touch because everyone has their thing they want and need, and that's close to their heart.
Extra, additional.
But
spending.
something's got to go, right? Like at the end of the day, you got to face the facts. We're not living in Candyland. We made this clear. The only solution is you got to cut spending, and this is going to be hard. And we should be having hard conversations about what needs to go. A lot of people
it's
think
really if I could build on that, it's really this pain that we're describing, the ultimate pain of actually, this debt coming due, I guess. Well, this debt actually causing problems, like real physical manifestations of, drastic change and negative impact to the economy. It's really off in the future, right? There's no tangible effect of the debt to any person in the country right now. It's just kind of something to think about, right? But if you were to spread the actual pain across time so that we would feel today, we would be doing something about it, right? If we just wait for it to actual affect us, well, that could be the end of the country. We could be so screwed. We could end up like, all these great civilizations through history that squandered their wealth and squandered their society. Right? If we don't want that to happen, we need to go against what our current incentive is, which is to not really care about it and to actually start to care, to artificially raise awareness to a level that would more match what the pain would be if it was actually spread across time. Right. So, and the earlier we do that, the earlier we're able to artificially raise the awareness, to artificially raise the amount people care, the less pain over time, the less net pain there will be.
Right.
The
longer you can think of it as like exercise, right? Exercise. Some people do just love exercising, but most people would rather not if they didn't have to,
Right.
And so it's a bit of pain now, but it makes you healthy in the long run, right? So if you never exercise, you're going to have a lot more pain where you might get like diabetes or a heart attack or something much worse than if you just do what you got to do every single day and just endure that little bit of extra pain every day. Because that's it. It actually, it would be a little bit of pain to fix this debt. It wouldn't be, we're not talking like catastrophic reformation here to fix this problem. It really isn't. It doesn't need to be. But if we don't, it will be catastrophic. It will be like a heart attack for the country.
Right.
If we don't do what we need to do every day. And so, really the debate I think we should be having with each other is how do we get our priorities back in line to something that is manageable? And so if we're talking about what else should we spend on, that's a non-starter for me. The people
Right.
who are talking about this are ignoring the reality that we face. They're not looking at the reality of our financials. They're acting like there's this infinite well of money out there to pay for whatever we want. And that's not true. We're already at the limits of the things we can have that we want. And we got to start picking things. Okay? And so that's really where the debate needs to be. And so, like, a lot of people think we should cut military. I'm one of those people. But that's only 15%. If we cut all of it, we're still deficit spending. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's that is not a solution. We can't have no military. I don't care if you don't like
Right.
war. I hate war. I think war is stupid. I don't think we should be fighting wars. But you need a military, okay? Especially
Right.
America. Okay? I maybe it shouldn't be as much as we're spending right now, but you're not going to be able to fix the problem just by cutting from the military.
Right.
So these other programs, the hard ones, the ones that are politically unpopular, those are the things we have to go after.
Right. What else?
I mean, we could get into what we think are potential options to cut, but I think we've done enough for just talking about the problem as it is now. And I think later on we can discuss possible specifics of what spending could potentially be cut to fix the problem. But I think maybe we should save that for a later date. I think really what I wanted to get out of this was to have people understand how much of an issue this is and how little it's talked about in public discourse.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can get you to think about this and talk about this, with your friends or your family or whatever, and start to think about the problem and how we can potentially solve it. Because right now, the politicians are ignoring it. We're ignoring it. The media is generally ignoring it. Even Jerome Powell is saying it's a big problem, but no one cares. No one really listens. They're just shoot, we don't care. Keep
Right.
lowering those interest rates. We'll be fine.
Yeah. What, I'm trying to think of a quote. It's why isn't there poverty? Or no, what is it? People ask why is there poverty?
People ask why is there poverty?
Right. But the real question is why isn't there poverty?
Right.
Which is where we came from. It's like the living standard, even as close as 150 years ago, was so different than what we enjoy today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like we have to we can't take that for granted. We have to actively understand what got us here, what's maintaining this exorbitant lifestyle that we enjoy.
Right.
I'm not bashing it. Like, that's awesome. Like, we should cherish that. We shouldn't squander it. We shouldn't just let it in the hands of, oh, I don't think it really affects my day to day, so I'm not going to think about it. Like, we should be analyzing our whole, economic presence, each and every one of us, and look at the government and say, are you analyzing your economic presence? Like, what are you, is what you're doing sustainable? Like, are you gambling with my future, with the future of my family, with the future of my, my society?
Right.
Like, that's a real question. If everyone was to ask themselves, there would be so much change, and it would really shift the topic of discussion in politics and economics today.
Right. Because the reality is that in the beginning of the human race, everyone was in poverty. Okay? And then slowly over time, more and more people have gotten out of poverty. And the most people have gotten out of poverty in recent history. And this is generally due to markets. Okay? And so, people they look around and there's still poverty. And it's noble that they want to help that, right? They want fewer people to be in poverty. That's noble. But the reality is fewer and fewer people are naturally in poverty as time has progressed because of technology, because of innovation. And so to look out and say, we can't stand for this. We have to get everyone out of poverty today is unrealistic. Okay. We all started there, and slowly through time, we're all getting out of it. And hopefully one day, there will be no more poverty. But to expect us to be able to do that all right now is no different than, in the Middle Ages saying, with the right king, there would be no poverty. That's just not true. They didn't have the technology we have today. There's no way the Middle Ages were ever going to lift everyone out of poverty with just political willpower. Okay? Mm-hmm. There's a limit. There are resources. There is scarcity, You can't just have everything you want right now. And so, and maybe you said if we just redistributed, then everyone could be out of poverty. But we're trying that, and it's not working. Yeah. So if that really was true, then why are we in such a predicament right now? Why is our country going to go bankrupt pursuing what is mostly this noble effort to eliminate poverty? Because that's most of our spending is in this effort. So I understand that this is something we should strive for. But if what we're doing is not working, if it's actually going to end up creating more poverty, then why are we doing it? Even if it's good intentions, who cares if the results make us all worse off?
Yeah, the worst thing you can do, according to Milton Friedman, is look at a policy in terms of its intentions as
right.
opposed to its results. The results are what matter.
Right. Like if you're playing golf and you hit it into the sand, and you're like, well, I meant to hit it onto the green. It's like, I don't care. You got to fix your stroke. You're doing it wrong. Like,
yeah.
It doesn't matter what your intention is. It matters what it achieves.
Right.
And so, the intentions are very noble for these things like Social Security and Medicare. But if they're unsustainable and are going to bankrupt the country, we could end up seeing a lot more people worse off because of these good intentions. So is that really worth it? I don't think so.
Right. I was talking about this to someone who told me that I said, the national debt's a real problem, and he said, is it? We've been saying that for 10 years. That
10 years.
It's a real problem. So it's not a problem, yet. So maybe it's not a problem. Maybe modern monetary theory, is a solution where you can kind of just keep spending at a deficit as long as you're issuing sovereign debt that people are willing to buy, or even if they're not willing to buy, as long as you're able to print the money to cover it, then you can keep on spending forever. And I think that just goes to show how much exorbitant privilege we've entertained through having like the world reserve currency status and just having a dollar that has been so stable over the years. But that should not be something that we should take for granted. Like, that is so fleeting.
Right. The reality is a lot of the rest of the world is supporting our standard of living by buying our bonds, which are, as it stands right now, not good investments if we continue on this path, right? So if we're not going to ever pay these debts back, then essentially the whole rest of the world is lending to us and we're never going to pay them back. And it's like, I think we've developed this false sense of security and standard of living that we can just do whatever we want without consequences.
Yeah. So if anyone tells you something along those lines, show them this podcast.
Tell them to do less.
Tell them to do less with John and Jeff. Well, yeah.
Yeah, and
because no one else is talking about it.
We're probably going to start to have some guests on here, probably some people with some different opinions, so that you don't get the feeling like we're just trying to propagandize you or whatever. Because one of the things that we think is really important is the best ideas win. Just right. So whoever has an idea, bring it out. Let ideas compete in a free market, just like everything else should compete in a free market.
Right.
Let the best idea win. And so we're convinced that we found the right ideas. And so we're open to hearing other ones because we believe that we'll be able to show that they're wrong.
Yeah, right. We are also not interested in any kind of like gotcha tactics. Like we want because we always try to bring up the opposite side and present it in a way that the best way we possibly can, but we can't verify that that's the correct argument that the other side is actually posing unless they're actually endorsing that side. So we want to present the best possible presentation of any given idea, and we're committed to that. We want the discourse to be, informed and progressing. So and we're committed to that. That's why we started this podcast. We want to get ideas out there. We want to start this conversation, not just among PhD economists, not just within economist circles. This is a day-to-day conversation that any person can have, right? Debt is something everyone understands. Like everyone has, well, not everyone, but a lot of people have credit cards. Everyone, with a credit card understands like what spending, going into the debt while spending means, right? This is just on a large scale. It's just as unsustainable. It always comes. Chickens always come back home to roost, right? What goes up must come down.
Yeah, and so we'll definitely start to, because obviously, in case you haven't noticed, me and John generally agree about everything. Not everything, but a lot of things. Right. And so we're gonna try to get some more people on here who potentially think differently than we do. And then, let the best ideas win, and we're not going to try to misrepresent them. We're not on here to bring them on and then edit them down to their dumbest statements just to make ourselves look good. Like, cause so many people do that today, and I find it disgusting. Honestly, it's so disingenuous. So that's not what we're going to try to do by bringing on guests, but we're going to try to do it to balance out what we're saying. Yeah, so more information will probably be linked down in the show notes. If you want to find out more about Do Less and what the future of Do Less is going to be. So tell your friends or don't.
For listening.
I'm not your dad. Thank you for listening.
See you next time.
Yeah, see you next time.